Hello everybody, welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. So I have 4 separate deck techs for you today. Now you may be wondering, why 4 deck techs? These are the decks that I will be playing in this year's Major League Commander. Now I recently did my draft video for this year's league, and you can check that out here on the channel if you're curious to more of the details of the drafting process. But there is a selection curated through a combination of the cEDH decklist database and other known brews in the cEDH world that we draft 4 decks from that we have to play throughout the entirety of the league. We can play each deck up to 3 times and a minimum of 2 times over, I believe, a 10-week period. So essentially 2 to 3 games per list will end up being what happens. Now I'm over here on MLCEDH.com. This is going to be the main place where you can find all information about the Major League Commander League this year. And once again, this is the second year this league has run, and last year I was able to take the whole thing down, so hoping for another victory this year. Let's go over here, and as you can see, there's actually a convenient deck list tab, so we're going to go over there. And if you look over in this section here, we can see my logo in the North Division. So we're going to go over there, and these are all 4 of the decks that I am playing this year. I have Abzan Stacks featuring Timna and Kodama, Clock Combo with Magda at the helm, Golgari Hulk with Grist the Hunger Tide, and Grixis Turbonaz with Rograkh and Silas. Now these are copies of our deck list. These aren't the original deck lists with some of our more creative names. As far as the website is concerned, they really try and just demonstrate what the archetype is you're playing, as opposed to, you know, a lot of the sillier names that exist in cEDH. So I'm going to go in alphabetical order here and just go down my deck list and do quick little deck techs on each of them. Now my first list, Abzan Stacks, is Timna and Kodama, and the entire point of the original list was to use Kodama as a stacks parity breaker, being able to then play a permanent out of your hand and get a second one onto the battlefield, whereas your opponents are locked under rule of law style effects and unable to continually do that. Now the original list had sort of a reanimator sub-theme, and they were leaning into Rograkh as the final win con of this deck. My variant that I'm playing for this year's MLC is a little bit different. I'm actually going a win con-less version of this deck, meaning that my win condition is actually just beating the heck out of people. So as we can see, we have sort of a standard ramp package here. We have great value creatures in Esper Sentinel and Serra Ascendant in the 1-drop, as well as Sylvan Safekeeper, protecting our valuable things, and then, you know, obviously having Serra Ascendant as basically just a flying beater. And then we start to get into a bunch of the stacks effects that are relevant in this deck. We'll get back to Priest of the Fellright, but in the 2 and 3 drop spot, we have cards like Cathar Commando, Douthie Voidwalker, Draenith Magistrate, Phyrexian Revoker, Kataki, Aethersworn Canonist, all insane 2-drop hate bears, Collector Oof. And then we have Archon of Emeria, Aven Mind Sensor, Eidolon of Rhetoric, Opposition Agent, Endurance. So as you can see, a lot of the general game plan is to just go turn 1 Dork and then turn 2 into one of our very potent hate bears, or a second Dork and another 2-drop hate bear. And the whole point of the early game is to get these hate bears out as soon as possible to start just stopping what your opponents are doing. Rule of Law effects are extremely strong in the current meta, as well as artifact hate effects being some of the strongest to back that up. So having the 2 of them in combination in a deck that can break parity on those effects is really, really strong. Hence one of the reasons I went with this version of the archetype, because I felt like while Rograkh was there, I would have to sacrifice a lot of my hate bears and not really be able to commit to either of those plans. But with my version, the way it's currently built, you really can commit to staxing your opponents down and then going into the late game where you then just put these giant threats into play that your opponents can't stop. 2 important cards here being Yi-San and Captain Sisay. They are some of our best card advantage engines outside of having Timna in the command zone, because of the fact that they are things that with Kodama, you can really dump your hand insanely fast, because Kodama allows you to just play one thing, drop another, play one thing, drop another. You know, if you have something like Opposition Agent, Endurance, or even Mind Sensor, now you're flashing in something on someone else's turn, dropping another. Yi-San in particular is is really crazy with Kodama, because then suddenly you are activating Yisan, putting a permanent into play, then being able to put in a permanent with less mana value onto the battlefield with Kodama's ability, and that keeps escalating and ramping up. Not only that, but when you activate Kodama's ability, it's obviously a triggered ability, so not being able to counter the things that you're putting into play as you start to ramp up Yisan's ability, that can get really scary really, really fast. And now I assume you're seeing here these top ends of this deck that I'm very, very excited about. We have Archon of Valor's Reach, just an insane card. You almost always name instant with it because that shuts down the win cons of and the protection of a significant portion of the format. This card lands, it plays its role in just being a clock and ending the game, and it also is just an insane stacks effect. So if your deck can play this card, jam it. Chancellor of the Annex is one that big shout out to Hire from Playing with Power. He's been on this card a good amount lately, and he was the one who sort of first put me onto it. And then I was also talking with Charles, the mono white guy, about this card. The fact that you can reveal it from your opening hand and it acts as an early game tax effect for your opponents before you've even cast a spell is pretty insane. So the fact that, you know, you can reveal this card in your opening hand and now suddenly your opponent's play of like turn 1 Soul Ring, which is a totally justifiable play, is now something they literally cannot do. So they have to wait until they get a second land. And there's many times that can actually like completely cripple someone's initial opening play. Like there's many hands that are like, oh yeah, I only kept 1 land, Soul Ring, and an Arcane Signet, which is a really solid ramp, you know, a turn 2, 4 to 5 mana. But with a Chancellor in the Annex, it really is super disruptive. And then this deck can really afford to have this card because at the top end, it's a 5/6 flyer that also presents itself as a stacks option and whenever your opponents are casting spells. So the card's actually pretty sweet. Classic stacks, WinCon, Elishnorn, obviously have to have it in a deck like this. The weird one we're here is definitely Kamal. So there's a number of factors that led me to have Kamal as the top end. The main one being I was playing around with Natural Order as just a win con for this deck, the ability to cast Natural Order with my board of Hate Bears and then, you know, sacrifice a dork and then present just what is the biggest green game-winning threat available. There was a number of thoughts for this to be Averbrook Caretaker instead, but I ended up going with Kamal because, I mean, it is just an overrun effect every combat. Its synergy with Elishnorn is kind of insane. The fact that you can, you know, start turning your opponent's lands into 1/1s and then have them just die to Elishnorn. And I mean, +3/+3 in trample is, for every single creature, every single combat, is an ability that makes your opponents dead very, very fast. We have some of the classic black tutors here. Not much to explain about that. Sort of same with the instant suites, just a lot of good value cards. You know, having access to black, white, and green gives you a lot of really solid instants in the format. We have our artifact suite here. You'll notice I'm on Collector Oof and I am playing Wishclaw Talisman. I think the ability to play Wishclaw and then tutor and either grab an opposition agent or a null rod or a collector oof is very, very strong. I think it's a great way to promote your game plan forward while also locking down your opponents. So treating Wishclaw Talisman as sort of your null rod tutor in a sense, or your opposition agent tutor is a strategy I like to use when I'm doing these sort of grindier stacks lists. I can definitely see people not liking that part of the strategy, but I have been very happy with using that strategy so far. And then obviously just having another tutor in the deck definitely provides increased potential for winning the game. And the rest of these artifact ramp pieces here just help us to get out either our early Kodama or some of our insanely expensive early ramp threats. We're not going as high as something like a Grim Monolith, even though it's a very defendable choice in this deck, but that's because we have a lot of the options as far as creature versions of effects like that, like Priest of Titania, we have Shaman of the Forgotten Ways, stuff like that. In the enchantments, we have a couple of the spicy options here. So classic options like Carpet of Flowers, Deafening Silence. I know Carpet of Flowers and Veil of Summer and Autumn's Veil are going to come up in discussion a little bit. I'm traditionally pretty low on those cards, but in the curated meta of the Major League Commander, there is a lot more consistency as far as the presence of blue decks, and especially in my division. So I'm playing against this group of people, Pongo, Spleenface, and Sick Robot. 4 times over the course of the season. And as you can see, there's a lot of blue in these pods. So where normally I might be a bit more hesitant to play Carpet of Flowers or Veil of Slumber into an open meta or a tournament meta, in these I'm basically guaranteed to play those cards. Back to the enchantments, we have Deafening Silence, classic when you're playing a stacks deck, super powerful card, same with Rule of Law. Another win con here in Defense of the Heart. As you could see with those lists, I was putting like 5-color Evolution Kenrith, 5-color Stacks Kenrith, Mardu mid-range creature stacks, Sultai mid-range, 4-color Druid, 4-color Druid. All of these are very, very, very creature-heavy decks, all of the ones that I'm showing here. And the MLC also just happens to have a good amount of creature-heavy decks in general. So Defense of the Hearth being either 4 mana, stop your opponents from playing their 3rd creature, have this threat on the board, or 4 mana, gets back to my turn, I have Defense of the Hearth trigger, sacrifice, and then I go get Elesh Norn and Kamal. Both of those effects, whichever one I get, seem pretty awesome to me. So Defense of the Hearth is not a card I normally play, but specifically for MLC and specifically if you're playing this type of win conless deck, I think Defense of the Hearth is pretty sweet in this deck. And then Leyline of the Void, I'm playing Leyline of the Void and not a traditional option like Rest in Peace because the fact that I wanted to keep some synergy with the graveyard. As I mentioned with Priest of the Fell Rites earlier, I have survival of the fittest lines, so I wanted to have more ways to be able to cheat creatures from my graveyard onto the battlefield, which is why I have Priest of the Fell Rites, because the way that works is you can discard any of your creatures, basically go up the line of getting rid of one of your giant threats here, and then with survival, putting them in the graveyard, and then tutoring Priest, and then Priest comes down, and then as soon as it doesn't have summoning sickness, you can activate it and reanimate those creatures. It also does the same thing if you put Priest in the graveyard because it has that Unearth ability that allows you to, for 3 white and black, bring it from the graveyard, it gets haste, and then you could activate its ability at that point. So Priest kind of just acts as this like mini graveyard package, as well as having access to such a powerful card as Survival of the Fittest just kind of makes the deck sing. So that's why we're on Leyline of the Void as opposed to a more traditional option like Rest in Peace. And I've found in Goldfishing that like Leyline of the Void's been in my opening hand a good amount of times, and this deck is sort of grindy enough that you can just cast it for 4 mana and still feel really happy about it. That's deck 1. Deck number 2, Magda Clock combo. So after its success at Marchesa 2022, I was in chat. I had my 2nd round pick coming in, and I decided to pick Magda because it was one of the decks that I assumed someone was going to scoop up right away. I knew there were really competent pilots on it. And I said, you know what, like this one's for chat. I'm going to do this as kind of a meme, but also as kind of like, you know, that this is a really strong deck and we'll have fun with it. And I'm so do not regret that decision because brewing in the space of playing Magda has been so much fun. I've loved mono red, and I haven't had a mono red deck that I have been able to really put the time and energy into that I appreciate. And it's been kind of funny because like during testing, I keep wanting to like play all of my decks, but I end up playing this deck because I'm just having so much fun playing it. It's definitely like if people play against Magda and they expect it to be like this unstoppable force, the deck does absolutely nothing. And that's kind of a lot of decks, but the deck is very unique in the way that it is a really unique mid-range pivot style deck and not like a fast combo list. And I think playing against it or playing with it will definitely allow people to see the strengths and limitations of the list. All of that aside, let's go into it. I talked a lot with Koibito, the winner of Marchesa 2022, about their list. I'm in the Magda, the Mono Red Discord right now. I've been talking a lot in there. I've been watching a lot of the conversation in there, a lot of the people's innovations. It's been a little complicated because New Capenna is coming out, and I'm like, okay, but what if I don't have access to New Capenna? Because in the MLC, Capenna came out. It was still coming out while deck lists were being submitted, so it wasn't fair if we didn't know the entire set, and therefore it was not a legal choice. So that was very interesting. So I have one Planeswalker here, Karn the Great Creator. This deck, as you can see, it has 33 artifacts, as well as the fact that our commander makes treasures, and the 33 artifacts actually doesn't even count the artifact dwarves we play, so that's 37 artifacts in total, and the treasures our commander makes. So being able to shut down your opponent's like dock size and things like that is very valuable, hence why I'm playing Karn the Great Creator. In the creature slot, you're going to see a bunch of these dwarves. The 1-drop ones are obviously extremely valuable. Ragavan's there because it basically does the same thing a dwarf does, but also gives you card advantage. Any of these changelings you see here are always just going to name dwarf, so Bloodline Pretender, Adaptive Automaton, Mental, Mimic, Universal Automaton. They are extremely important when it comes to the combo of the deck. I explained that a little bit in the Marchesa 2022 video, but basically the way it works is you have an artifact dwarf, so something like Universal Automaton. You have Clock of Omens, and you have Magda on the battlefield. And the way that it works is you'll tap to the artifacts, including the dwarf itself, to untap one of your artifact dwarves. And what that will create is a situation in which artifact dwarves will untap, and then you'll have an untapped treasure. And you use that treasure and the dwarf to, once again, tap 2 artifacts, being those 2, and then untap the dwarf again. And what this will do is create infinite tapped treasures. From that point, you're able to win the game through a series of tutors. And my list has a couple of variations from Koibito's list, the winning one from Marchesa 2022, in what you tutor for as far as like your main targets and when you're trying to win the game. But a lot of it's still very similar. I still have the Bogarden Hellkite, and that is often the main outlet for winning the game. But as you can see, I don't have the Skirk Prospector that Koibito was playing, which would allow you to sacrifice the Hellkite when you have a Masquid Nexus on the battlefield. My lines involve actually using Cloudstone Curio and the Hellkite, so it's a little bit different. A number of lists, including Koibito's, were not on Cloudstone Curio as an outlet in the deck. One, I think it's a really clean way to actually like end the game. Some people are playing Grinding Station for that reason, but I think having the Hellkite and Cloudstone Curio really cleans up the end line of this deck. And the fact that it just opens up a Magda list combo in the deck in which you still will need Magda at the end state, but having Dockside, Cloudstone Curio, and another permanent that allows you to, or another creature that allows you to bounce Dockside infinitely will allow you to make infinite treasures. So say Magda costs something ridiculous like 8, you're not just like out of the game. You still can have this Dockside Curio combo that will allow you to scrap that together and be able to win. And it's won me at least one game in testing and it's come close to winning me another game in testing so far. So I'm very happy with the inclusion. And obviously, as I said, it is my main win outlet as well. So very happy with that include and change. So artifact dwarves obviously come at a bit of a premium, which is why we're willing to pay up to 2 and 3 mana for them. The only other 2 mana dwarves each have a tap ability to destroy a non-basic land, which have come in handy a good amount and just add a lot of utility to list, as well as kind of giving you a grindier late game engine. And then Dwarven Blood Boiler, which basically gives all your dwarves haste as far as tapping is concerned and allows you to tap them outside of combat, which is pretty huge. Same reason we're playing actually some vehicles that, they're very normally associated with standard or limited and stuff like that. But vehicles allow you to tap your dwarves outside of combat, which is actually pretty big. A lot of other versions of this deck are playing Blood Moon. I'm choosing to play Magus of the Moon over it. Basically, the idea behind that being, I think the ability of Magus of the Moon to avoid responses on the stack is better than Blood Moon's ability to be a non-creature spell and avoid creature removal. That and the fact that Blood Moon feeds Docksides, whereas Magus of the Moon does not feed Dockside, is which is obviously one of the worst cards to see when you're against a Blood Moon is a Dockside. So obviously it's pretty rough. And then the last creature in the creature slots worth talking about is Zorn. Basically just doubles your treasure output, very good, and also provides combo in the late game. I got some classic rituals here in Jessica's Will and Rite of Flame. I'm on Sudden Demise. Choose a color. It deals X damage to each creature of the chosen color. I think this card's really, really solid for this list specifically. I think, as you saw when I was breaking down my division there's a lot of mid-range dork heavy decks, and I also expect to see a lot of creature heavy white decks. So my impression, or not in my pod specifically, but like as sort of the alternate option. So for example, something like Winota, Sudden Demise is really solid against that, as well as being really solid against a bunch of like the Thrasio style deck. You can name green with Sudden Demise and then wipe all of your opponent's dorks and all of your dwarves and Magda and all of your automatons. They're all completely untouched. So Sudden Demise, I thought was worth it to include, especially given how grindy the MLC meta is going to be, especially the pods that I'm going to be playing against. In the instant spot, we have a lot of spot removal, just trying to play as much free stuff as we can. Stoke the Flames is so cool when I first saw that as a Magda include, because I haven't seen it since I started playing Standard back in the day, but the fact that it's an instant speed removal spell that you can actually play for free in a number of instances, which I've done a couple times, and that also taps your dwarves and triggers Magda and basically gives some dwarves haste in that circumstance. It's super cool. I'm a big fan of Stoke the Flames, and I love that I get to play it here in Magda. It just sends me back down memory lane as far as like one of the first standard formats I really invested a lot of time in, because I basically started playing at M15 time. Something to note about cards like Abrade and You Find Some Prisoners, the abilities are very powerful, but the fact that it says destroy target artifact actually has a lot of utility that it normally wouldn't have in a standard deck, because of the fact that we're playing a number of cards that allow you to turn permanents into artifacts. So things like Liquid Metal Coating, Liquid Metal Torque, Ashnod's Transmigrant. So all of those things allow you to turn other things into artifacts. So all of these shatter effects, so things like Abrade, You Find Some Prisoners, actually have a lot more utility. Magda has the luxury of being able to remove enchantments and things like that, which is normally really hard for red to do. So for example, your opponent has a Rhystic Study on the battlefield. You can turn Liquid Metal Torque, having that turn into Rhystic Study into an artifact as well as an enchantment, and then you can use your Mog Salvage for free and blow it up. So there's a lot of utility with these artifact destruction effects that it really goes farther beyond what we're used to. Additionally, Pithing Needle is not often played in Magda list, or at least the ones that I'm seeing publicly on the database as well as Koibito's list. Once again, with all the Thrasios decks that I'm going to be going up against, or these Kenrith lists, it felt really imperative for me to have sort of this, not only like a 1-mana option, but an option I can tutor off of Magda to really stop my opponents just trying to grind me out of the game. Damping Sphere also I haven't seen in a lot of Magda lists. I think it's really, really solid in here, and I just wouldn't leave home without it, given how fast the meta has a potential to be. So if you're playing against any more of the proactive lists in the format, I think having an option like Damping Sphere to basically be your red rule of law is really solid, because this deck is not like a super explosive combo deck. You're not trying to like play a bunch of spells in the same turn. Your first couple turns of the game, you're going to play a couple spells just so you can get your curve going, but it's not anywhere near an ad nauseum style deck. So you can afford to play cards like Damping Sphere, you can afford to play Thorn of Amethyst, Sphere of Resistance, stuff like that, because you're not really caring about casting spells. I'm definitely going to skip over a number of specific includes here, just because of the fact that Magda is such an intricate deck and all of the cards have a ton of different utility. So I could spend hours just talking about this list alone. If you guys want an individual deck tech where I go into detail on my Magda list, really into detail, I'm happy to do that, but I'll keep moving on, as we say. Godpharaoh statue is one that I know a lot of people were kind of like humming and hawing on. Some people are playing defense grid over it. I think this as an option to stop your opponents interacting when you're comboing off, as well as I've won a couple games with this deck just by resolving a Godpharaoh statue or activating Magda once when I couldn't go for the combo, but I could activate Magda once, and your opponent's spells costing 2 more is real. It's a real thing that your opponents have to deal with, and they struggle underneath it for sure. So the card is really strong. Spine of Ishsa, I know Koibito was not playing, and a lot of the other Magda lists that exist right now, especially the ones on the database, they tend to lean towards either having a Meteor Golem or a Spine of Ishsa. I think it's really important to be able to have a tutor with Magda that can go and grab you a removal piece for any permanent on the battlefield. Once again, covering up a lot of the weaknesses that a mono-colored deck, especially mono-red, would have. So I think Spine's super important to this deck. I think I would be very hesitant to sleeve up a Magda list and not include either Spine or Meteor Golem. And there's the argument of, well, you could use the Liquid Metal Coating thing like we talked about earlier with something like Abrade, or You Find Some Prisoners. But given that circumstance, I still think that having to have a completely separate spell on top of having to have a Magda activation and having to cast a spell is a much bigger ask than obviously just activating Magda once and then blowing up the thing that's stopping you from comboing off, right? Especially if you're, for example, under like a Stony Silence and you have your Magda, you can just boop, grab Spine, blow the thing up. But you couldn't do that with the Liquid Metal Coating, Liquid Metal Torque things like we talked about earlier, because they are artifact abilities that need to be activated. So I think it's pretty important to have Spine. Stranglehold, fantastic red card. Not much really more to say about it. You're on 27 lands. You see some weird ones here like Holdout, Sediment, and Survivor's Encampment. Those basically give your dwarves haste because they allow you to tap them for mana, which obviously triggers Magda and stuff like that. A lot of cuter stuff here. The change that I have brought to the archetype that not a lot of Magda players are playing, I have switched all of my mountains for snow-covered mountains, and I'm playing Mouth of Ronan. I have done this in almost every monocolored deck I play, just because the fact that having a removal piece on a land is pretty strong, and just being able to switch your mountains to snow-covered mountains is a very minimal requirement of a difference and change, and then you get free removal on a land. And having one more colorless land isn't really that big of a deal. So switching all the mountains to snow-covered mountains, adding a Mouth of Ronan, I think that was the biggest change I did as far as the mana base for Magda. That's deck 2. All right, Golgari, Hulk. We got Grist, the Hunger Tide. So this is a very proactive list. The original list is called 12 Entombs. And the way this works is you use Grist's ability to either get a Protean Hulk into play, or you use the abilities to sacrifice the Protean Hulk when you have it in play. Unlike a lot of the Golgari Hulk lines, this deck is playing multiple Hulk lines with Grist, because basically it's a turbo Hulk list. And I originally, when I saw the list on the database, the list on the database is playing the Ballista Machias lines as well as the classic Disciple of the Vault, Lesser Massacre, Malira lines. And I was like, I do not want to play 2 different Hulk packages. That's so lame. So I cut the Ballista Machias one, and through play testing and through a bunch of my hands, I was like, oh no, it's 100% right. The amount of times I would draw one of the pieces to one of these different combos, specifically the 3-piece combo here, I would draw a piece and then basically be out of the game because I couldn't win, or if I could win, it would be a lot slower. And I would like have my turn completely disrupted by drawing one of these pieces. So with that being said, I decided to do the layering here of playing Ballista on top of that. And it's so far been really solid. I've been able to draw combo pieces and still be able to go off. And the fact that like Ballista and Machias are like not the worst cards in the entire world to draw. They have utility outside of their combos. So it's nice in that aspect as well. So for those who don't know, this deck, the whole point of it is to get a Protean Hulk into play. Protean Hulk, when sacrificed, will get you 6 CMC worth of stuff, and whether through the Machias Ballista combo or through the one I mentioned with Disciple of the Vault, Lesser Massacre, and Malira, will kill your opponents right there on the spot. That's the entire point of the list. You're trying to do that as quickly as possible, and the reason to pick Grist here is twofold. One is the fact that the -2 ability is a sacrifice outlet, so it allows you to sacrifice either Protean Hulk or a creature that you've put a Pattern of Rebirth onto to go get you your Protean Hulk, etc., etc. It's good to have the Protean Hulk sacker right in the command zone, which is super cool, which is one of the reasons that Virals has been a deck for such a long time. Now, you can only do this ability once, which definitely does come up with things like the Pattern of Rebirth, Natural Order that we were just talking about. However, it's not like a huge deal because you don't have access to things like Arena Rector and stuff like that. So it only being one sacrifice isn't that big of a deal. And then the other part is the fact that Grist turns all of your top deck tutors into Entombs. Because of its +1 ability, it allows you to create a 1/1 black insect, then you mill a card. If it's an insect, you repeat this ability and put a loyalty counter on Grist and repeat the process. So with that being said, you can do something like, okay, I'm gonna cast an Imperial Seal or a Sylvan Tutor or a Worldly Tutor, right? And when you do that, so let's say we cast our Worldly Tutor, I'm gonna put Protean Hulk on top of my library. Now I'm gonna +1, and I'm gonna mill my Protean Hulk into my graveyard. So having 2 functional abilities, each of them that help with the Protean Hulk game plan, allows this deck to actually have a lot of just innate synergy in the command zone. So it's really cool, and it's just a very clean Protean Hulk list. A lot of mana dorks here. We have Sylvan Safekeeper, which allows you to, if you do a double pile, which means you get a second pile with Body Snatcher here, allows you to have what's called the protected pile. And the protected pile will basically be able to have these combos that I'm demonstrating here, but without being able to be affected by creature removal. So that's what Sylvan Safekeeper really does for the deck. We have Apprentice Necromancer, which is one of the best reanimation effects because it brings back your Protean Hulk and then sacrifices at the end of the turn, obviously triggering Protean Hulk and getting you a win for the game there. We have our sacrifice outlets in Carrion Feeder and Viscerous here. They're the best in the format right now because they come in as a creature on 1 mana, super efficient what they do. They're unlimited sacrifices. Have some grindier cards in here like Dark Confidant and Douthie. Dark Confidant specifically because of the fact that we really don't have any any card advantage in the command zone. We have our ability to make 1/1s, and we have removal in the command zone, which is super helpful, as well as all of the utility we talked about earlier, but we don't have card advantage. So we definitely need to lean on options that get us a little more card advantage. Opposition Agent, great hate bear for the deck, for the format. Speaking of card advantage, we have Orin Frostfang. I think this card's really solid in this list. If you're desperate, you can use your natural order to get your Frostfang if for some reason your Protean Hulk's not in your deck anymore. That's obviously not the main game plan or even really the secondary game plan, but it's an option that I wanted to point out. But the ability to turn the 1/1s that are basically vanilla 1/1s into Death Touchers that push through combat, because no one wants to trade, their Tymnas for a 1/1 Death Touch token. And then when they connect, you're drawing a ton of cards. So it turns Grist +1 ability into suddenly a really big card advantage engine. So Frostfang's pretty solid in this list. Okay, so the combo we mentioned. And then I wanted to have alternate reanimation targets. One being Vilis, because Vilis is super solid. It can come in, if you use something like Reanimate or Life Death on it, it can draw you 8 cards, and it has its activated ability to draw you even more cards. So 1, it's drawing you towards your win condition, and 2, it's controlling the board by giving creatures, -X, depending on how many times you pay into it. Vilis is super solid in that way, but I also wanted a card that if I had to Entomb Reanimate on early turns of the game, and I felt like this was the best play, I wanted Void Winnower here, because Void Winnower is, I think it's really slept on in general. I think this is just an underplayed card, and I'm really excited to be playing it in this reanimation style list. But I think there are many times that you can early reanimate a Void Winnower and completely shut down the game. I think there are decks that cannot straight up win through a Void Winnower being on the battlefield. Yes, there are times that you could lose to something like a Chain of Vapor, obviously, and it's definitely a real possibility. But you can also have your opponents there with, a bunch of 0 mana rocks in their hand and their Demonic Tutor and an Assassin's Trophy, and they're looking at all of these cards that are supposed to be super strong, and they're like, I can't even cast a single one of these. So Void Winnower is really strong, as well as, the fact that it's 11/9. That is a big threat. It has a form of evasion with the fact that your opponents can't block with creatures with EMCMCs. So, it puts a clock on the table for sure, as well as staxing it out really hard. And that's kind of why I have it as my reanimation target here. It requires no investment on your board to have previously been made. You just need to have the ability to get it onto the battlefield. Bone Shards, I really like. 1, it's a sacrifice outlet for Protean Hulk, and it's an additional cost to sacrifice a creature there. So it, gets around the fact that your opponents could counter Bone Shards, and you still would have sacrificed your Protean Hulk, as well as the fact that it allows you to discard a Hulk out of your hand or a combo piece out of your hand if you end up with drawing a combo piece that you need in the graveyard, or you draw your Protean Hulk instead of being able to entomb it. So Bone Shards I really like. It's one of my adds to the archetype that I'm pretty proud of. Scheming Symmetry is a weird one that's often never played, but for the reasons that we talked about earlier, where you can turn your top deck tutor into an entomb, it is playable for that reason alone. Please don't use this the fair way, because you will lose the game. Collective Brutality, discard thing like we talked about before. It's removal. The ability to, peek into your opponent's hands when you're playing such a proactive deck is really helpful. A lot of tutors here, a lot of reanimation effects. Footsteps of the Goryo is like a classic modern Hulk thing, but it's pretty cool. You just reanimate Protean Hulk, and then at the end step, you sacrifice it, which is awesome, because this turns, Entomb plus Footsteps into a win, as opposed to you needing either a sack outlet on the battlefield, your commander, or something like that. Footsteps is pretty cool. We're just playing a lot of efficient removal here, some Entomb options, tutors, top deck tutors specifically for Grist. Vendetta is just another removal piece. Shallow Grave, instant speed reanimation option. Wake the Dead, instant speed reanimation option that also sacrifices at the end step. You're noticing the theme's pretty common here. Very slim artifact suite. At one point I was on Collector Oof. I don't think I ended up sticking with it. Yeah, I'm not on it in this final version, but just because you don't really need a lot of artifacts. That's not what the deck's trying to do, right? We're not trying to ramp out into an early ad nos or something like that, right? We're trying to get our game plan, and we're trying to get it done as quickly as possible. And then Skull Clamp is here for the option to basically, once again, the Orin Frostfang argument. Sometimes the game doesn't go quite your way, and you need to turn those 1/1 that Grist makes into 2 cards, which is pretty solid. Skull Clamp's kind of broken. So when your commander can make 1/1s every turn, seems pretty good. Wishclaw in green black, as we mentioned before, so you can like go grab an opposition agent. We don't have oof in this deck, as I said, but between the ability to go grab an opposition agent with my Wishclaw, go grab a reanimation effect, go grab Footsteps Legorio, all these proactive options, as well as having Culling Ritual. Culling Ritual as a Wishclaw target is one of my favorite things because that turns into 5 mana, make a ridiculous amount of mana, wipe your own Wishclaw so your opponents never get to use it. It's just such a cool synergy, and I love that. Over the enchantments, bunch of reanimation effects, Pattern of Rebirth, classic Protean Hulk card, nothing too crazy here. And as far as the mana base, it is a lot of value lands in this 2-color mana base. Emergent Zone, really good for opening up instant speed win conditions. But apart from that, a pretty standard mana base as far as green-black decks go. It's a little light on fetch lands because we are really leaning into a lot of the utility lands. The database one, I think, is on something like 27 lands, and I thought that was kind of insane. And when I was goldfishing hands, I was like, I could never cast my spells. So I'm up to 30, and I think with a commander without innate card advantage and being able to turn all of our lands into utility lands helps a lot with not really feeling like you're flooding out. We have things like Boseiju, Cabal Pit, Emergent Zone, Phyrexian Tower being sack outlet. I put in Takenuma, which allows you to, put cards in your graveyard and allows you to recur cards. We have Nurturing Peatland, and allows you to draw cards. So even though I'm up to 30 lands and feeling pretty confident about having 30 lands, they also are lands that do a lot of stuff and have a lot of utility. So it doesn't really feel like you're flooding at all. That's deck number 3. Last but not least, my first pick for this tournament, Grixis Turbo Naz, i.e. Rograkh Silas. For those who've known me for some time, this is the archetype that I took to the top 4 of Marchesa 2021. So it is a deck I feel very comfortable with, as well as, it's the deck that I keep coming back to whenever I just want to head down, play ad nauseum. But I think Rograkh Silas is just insane in the fact that, Silas is whatever, but it opens up the colors that you need to have Rograkh in this Grixis shell. I did a lot of work on that archetype. I kind of went back and forth with how much interaction should you be playing on the deck, and I actually cut a bunch of interaction from the list in favor of having a cleaner game plan. There's still a lot of interaction, don't get me wrong. It's still a Grixis list. I'm not just, not playing any interaction in the stack, but I had attempted to make the deck a little bit more interactive at one point, but found that it was so anti-synergistic with what I was trying to do that I've put it back into this shell, and now I'm feeling pretty comfortable with it. So let's go through the options. Some of the creatures are probably some of the weirdest options in the deck. I'm playing Divining Witch. Basically, the idea behind Divining Witch is you play Divining Witch, and once again, we don't have any card advantage in the command zone. We have a ton of mana because of the fact that Rograkh basically turns a ton of different cards into mana ramp. Rograkh's really, really strong in that sense, so mana is never really the problem. Card advantage can be the problem. So with that, Divining Witch being able to go 2 mana, I play this card. Next turn, I have the ability at any time to Demonic Consultation for a card. Now you can use that defensively by going and grabbing a spell. Obviously I have lost the game with Divining Witch, needing to grab something like a Dress Down and then, having Dress Down in the top 6 and just losing the game. It happens. It totally happens, part of the game. But the power of Divining Witch is being able to have this Demonic Consultation effect on the field and not needing to be cast for turn. So it's huge when you're playing against Rule of Law style decks. And the ability to end step, I'm going to activate Divining Witch, name Thassa's Oracle, go back to my turn, play Thassa's Oracle. With Thassa's Oracle's ability in the stash, I'm going to activate Divining Witch a second time, get rid of the rest of my library is huge, because the fact that unless Thassa's Oracle is in your top 6 the first time you activate it, that is just an instant 1-card assembler of a win con. And obviously the Consultation win con has always been something that is a definitive 2-card combo. Divining Witch in a sense turns it into a 1-card combo, which is really huge. I think it's a very big boon for that archetype. I play this in slower Consultation decks, and I've been playing this more and more in faster Consultation decks, and I haven't been disappointed as of late. I think it actually adds a dynamic layer to a consult, or to a more proactive list like this one. I'm playing a second Consultation win con here in Lab Maniac. I figured if I'm playing Consultation, I'm playing Tainted Pact, and I'm playing Divining Witch, not having a second Thassa's Oracle style effect would be pretty weak, along with the fact that Laboratory Maniac opens up a lot of utility in the pods that I was just talking about when you're underneath the Rule of Law. The ability to end step, if you have a lab man on the battlefield, to be like, okay, on the end step before my turn, I'm going to cast Demonic Consultation and exile my entire library. And under Rule of Law, right, this is totally something you can do. And then if they go to your turn, you have protection up to protect Laboratory Maniac, but you'll just go to draw for your turn and you haven't cast any spells at all during your turn and you win the game. It's super simple. Or you can do that on your upkeep, right? It is one way, a single card to get rid of your entire library. So Lab Maniac, pretty solid as far as, using your consult to the most efficient ways possible, having both Thassa's Oracle and Lab Maniac. I'm on Jace. Jace being able to provide flashback as well as being able to provide card selection in the early game, I think is pretty important. Some people are playing things like Mizzix's Mastery, and I would just prefer something like Jace, which is a lot more potent when you are going into the early game, having Jace there to loot and be able to fix your hand. So, there'll be times when you have too many top end threats and you're able to get rid of one and grab a piece of interaction. Jace has actually been pretty solid so far. There are hands when, you never need to cast it because you're doing the classic turbo ad nauseum thing, but there are other times when it's actually really, really helpful and it helps as sort of a second shot at going for your win con. Notion Thief is here because we're playing a bunch of wheel effects, and Notion Thief is really strong when you're playing a bunch of wheel effects. Bunch of classic Grixis good stuff here. Void Snare is here because of the fact that it is the most flexible sorcery speed version of that effect. I don't normally love playing sorcery speed bounce, but Void Snare in particular because it hits any non-land permanent and has no downside like Chain of Vapor, although we're also playing Chain of Vapor. We're playing Void Snare, we're playing Alchemist Retrieval, and we're playing Chain of Vapor, so a lot of just bouncing non-land permanents. We want to be able to have the flexibility to not just lose to certain permanent types. Displacement Wave is a me special, a card that I don't hear a lot of people talking about outside of this. Basically, the thinking here is with Displacement Wave, it's like having a board wipe like Toxic Deluge. Obviously, if you're playing against larger creatures, you want something like a Toxic Deluge, which is tough because Displacement Wave doesn't really hit those things. However, what Displacement Wave does do is if you are playing against a bigger stacks deck or multiple stacks decks, and they have things like Collector Roof on the battlefield, they have a Deafening Silence on the battlefield, they have Thalia on the battlefield, suddenly you're staring at all these effects that are absolutely pantsing you, and you have these usually a bunch of 0 mana artifacts, you have Rograkh, stuff like that. So you can do a Displacement Wave for 3, bounce all of the stacks effects that are on the battlefield. Now you've invested 5 mana into this, it's true, but if you have all of these mana rocks, a lot of the times they can pay for a number of the mana that gets put in Displacement Wave, and then they get bounced back to your hand, and therefore you can play them again and use them for mana right away. That's sort of the thinking behind that card, and once again, the fact that you don't really care about a lot of the permanents that you put on the battlefield. The ones you really care about are like Divining Witch, Jace, again, being able to reset your dockside's pretty hot, or Notion Thief, right? And then as far as other permanents, Wish Claw for a Displacement Wave, and then bounce your Wish Claw back to your hand. And then the other ones you care about are like Remora, Study, Dress Down, Necropotence. That's not a lot of permanents you care about having on the battlefield that you can't just replay. So for that reason alone, Displacement Wave actually feels pretty solid in the current meta. I have Transmute Artifact in here because Silas is an artifact creature, and the ability to put Silas on the battlefield, get some occasional value out of it. There are times with which the card is actually decent, especially when it comes to grindier games, being able to play Silas as a death touch blocker and then have that out on the battlefield to dissuade your opponent from attacking you. And then the turn after that, which obviously your life total is very important if you're playing Turbo Adnod. So being able to then turn a Silas into a Bolas's Citadel is pretty strong. With the artifact creature in the command zone, it felt like a pretty relevant piece to play. Playing a ton of tutors. I know Grim Tutor isn't often played, but my thinking here was, once again, we don't have card advantage in the command zone, and I like just having another unconditional tutor to go grab whatever we need at the time. Praetor's Grasp is the same thing. Mnemonic Betrayal, we're playing Windfall and Wheel of Fortune, and we're playing Grinding Station, stuff like that. Your opponents are playing a lot of wheels, so Mnemonic Betrayal is just really solid, especially in the mid to late game. The card just pops off. You're going to see here with this deck, I am playing Peer into the Abyss. We saw I'm playing Bolas's Citadel. I'm also playing Ad Nauseam. I'm playing all 3 of the effects. Rograkh, with the way the efficiency that this deck can be built, it is very easy to play all of those effects and not really get punished because Rograkh is just so strong. Rograkh makes your Ad Nauseam, like your post Ad Nauseam wins, super, super clean. It makes your Bolas's stuff cleaner too. So for that, I think playing all 3 effects, once again, we don't have card advantage, so we need to be able to get our effects as soon as possible. Having the redundancy of having Pier, Citadel, and Ad Nause helps the deck a lot as far as that's concerned. And then, you know, the fact that you don't really get punished for it is pretty nice. Even with all 3 of those effects, our converted mana cost that Ad Nause is still only 1.3, so really solid. And once again, Rograkh really reduces the amount of mana you really need post Nause to be able to just win the game. And then a lot of classic Grixis interaction here. Something you'll see from this list, I'm playing Mindbreak Trap over Force of Negation. We talked earlier about how I was skimping on certain forms of interaction. Mindbreak Trap feels like a better free counterspell in the sense that it stops what we want to stop in the earlier game. And Force of Negation doesn't help protect a deck as proactive as this one, as well as it costs you a card in your hand. And when your commanders don't provide you any card advantage, going down 2 cards to stop your opponent's winning is something you can't really afford to do, unfortunately. So that's why Mindbreak Trap has the inclusion over Force of Negation. And there's also could be an argument to not include Mindbreak Trap as well, but I think Mindbreak Trap has enough utility, especially against other Ad Nauseam decks, as well as having the option to be more proactive. I think it is worth the include in this spot. Some interesting clues for the artifacts are on Aether Spellbomb. It's just another way to bounce your dockside. It is creature removal. It is repeatable card draw with Silas. As I mentioned, this deck wants to play Silas a little more than the average Rograkh Silas list. So I think Aether Spellbomb kind of earns its place for that reason, especially with the include of Grinding Station here. Grinding Station, great for value with Silas, but also fantastic with Underworld Breach and any of either Soul Ring, Mana Vault, Mox Amber, Mox Diamond, Mox Opal, any of these cards. I guess not Mox Diamond technically, but you can mill your entire library with any of those cards, and Underworld Breach. Here down the enchantments, we have Remora, Ristic Study, Classics. Dress Down, you're playing so few creatures, and a lot of the creatures that you are playing, the only one that really gets really negatively affected by this is Notion Thief. Apart from that, you can't win with your consult effects when Dress Down's on the battlefield, but you can usually find alternate ways. For example, using your Underworld Breach to, you know, mill your entire library and then just like bounce your Dress Down after you've already like started winning the game. Many different ways to take advantage of the fact that Dress Down doesn't really affect your deck almost at all and can completely hose creature decks in the format. And then we're on Necropotence because this deck is super proactive, so you get to be on Necropotence. Nothing crazy in the mana base either. So those are my 4 deck lists for Major League Commander this year, and that is 4 deck techs for the price of 1. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked this video and you want to keep finding out more stuff about the MLC, make sure to hit like and subscribe. It helps out the channel a ton, and it allows you to know every time we post. I'm going to be doing a lot of coverage of my progress in the MLC, as well as just continuing to cover, you know, cEDH tournaments. I have one coming up near me, which is pretty cool. I can't wait to report on that. And I'm going to keep doing all the normal stuff. So if you want to get all of that content, make sure to subscribe and hit that little bell icon because it tells you whenever I come out with new videos. Question for you and the audience. What do you think is your favorite deck that I've drafted this year? Is it Abzan Kodama stacks? Is it Magda clock combo? Is it Grist, Golgari Hulk, or Rograkh Ad Nauseam? I would love to hear down in the comments below what your favorite list that I drafted this year, or if you were able to watch the draft this year, what is your favorite deck that got drafted out from underneath me? What is your favorite deck that got drafted by another player that you didn't expect to get drafted? I would love to hear all of those things in the comments down below. All right, everybody. Thanks for watching. Have an amazing week. Catch you next time. Peace.